A donkey and her colt, palm branches, cloaks on the road, shouting crowds, overturned tables at the temple. It feels like an avalanche of symbols that threaten to completely overwhelm us. What do they all mean? Each of these symbols were rooted deep within Israel's history, some dating back 1,000 years. I'm Michael, the Bible Rethinker, and it's time to rethink. To make sense of the imagery on Palm Sunday, we need to start with Israel's first great king, David. The boy who slew the giant spent years running through the wilderness, narrowly escaping King Saul's clutches. Finally, after Saul's violent end at his own hand, David became king. And when David became king, the capital of Israel was a city called Hebron. He wanted to move the capital 20 miles north to Jerusalem, but there was a big problem. You see, Israel didn't have control of Jerusalem. It was a city occupied by the Jebusites. That was a different ethnic group than the Israelites. Up to this point, Israel had never controlled Jerusalem. And so when David arrived with his army, the Jebusites taunted him from within their walls. "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off," they said. You see, the topographical features of Jerusalem made it nearly impregnable in ancient warfare. It did have a vulnerability, however. When commencing the battle, David said, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies." David's riposte was the origin of what became a saying: "The blind and lame will not enter the palace." Keep this saying in mind. It will come up again later. David was successful in defeating the Jebusites, and he moved his capital to Jerusalem. David had been able to gain full control over the nation of Israel, and he was even able to subdue his enemies. Yet there was a major problem with his dynasty that threatened his undoing. You see, David made the unfortunate mistake of marrying several women, despite being prohibited to in the Torah, the early books of the Old Testament. His polygamous marriages led to sibling rivalries and scandal, even murder within his own household. Absalom, his own son, spent years cleverly undermining David's administration. He patiently worked and waited until it was finally the moment to strike, and he launched a coup that led to David fleeing for his life. When David and his entourage fled, they headed east over the Mount of Olives. They crossed over the Mount of Olives and continued northeast to the Jordan River and crossed that body of water as well. You see, David needed physical boundaries to ensure his safety as well as the safety of those around him. And after maintaining control for a while, Absalom was horrifically neutralized. While riding on a mule, his long hair got caught in an oak tree. Before he was able to escape, David's general, Joab, plunged 3 javelins into his heart. And all this transpired while David was in hiding. But even after King Absalom's death, David couldn't just show up at Jerusalem at this point and expect to reclaim his throne. The people had rejected David and accepted the rule of Absalom. But eventually the people longed for David to return and rule over them as king. David was still grieving the death of his son with his head covered and his feet bare. But he began the trek west back to Jerusalem. He crossed the Jordan River, retracing the steps of the Israelites from the days of Joshua. He continued west until he crossed over the Mount of Olives and entered Jerusalem from the east. At long last, the king had returned. Click the like button if you are beginning to see how this story foreshadowed Palm Sunday. Early during David's administration in Jerusalem, he had an illustrious palace, but God was still residing in the tents, also known as the tabernacle, that the Israelites had constructed back in their time in the wilderness. This disparity of living circumstances bothered David. So he wanted to build a permanent temple to replace the tabernacle. But God told David through the prophet Nathan he would not be the one to build the temple, but that duty would fall to his son. Nevertheless, in his lifetime, David began collecting materials for the future construction of the temple. After he died, Solomon began the construction of the temple that was, by all accounts, impressive. When the temple was completed, there was a major celebration coinciding with the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. And in the midst of their worship, the glory of the Lord came down to reside in the temple. It was manifested by fire and prevented anyone from being able to enter the temple that day. This was the beginning of a long-standing tradition in Israel. While the priests were responsible for ministering within the temple, it was the king who was responsible for the construction and the maintenance of the temple. Think back to Hezekiah and Josiah, for example. When they led their people back to worshiping the Lord, they also saw major renovations and restorations in the temple. In the days before Jesus, King Herod tried to legitimize his reign over the Jews by overseeing the construction of the vast Herodian temple. The king and the temple were inseparably linked. More than that, the king and God were linked as well. In Psalm 2, for instance, David was called the Son of God. That is, he was the divinely appointed representative of God in the world. That is what made the failures of the kings and the ultimate fall of Judah so tragic. It was when King Jehoiakim, the descendant of David, was in exile in Babylon when Ezekiel had a vision. He could see the temple in Jerusalem, and he saw the glory, the presence of the Lord abandon the temple. When the Spirit of God left the temple, he followed the same route David traveled centuries earlier. He traveled east from the temple and passed over the Mount of Olives. And yet there was hope. Israel foresaw a day when God, who was the ultimate king of Israel, would return to his temple. How would he return? Ezekiel saw the glory of God coming from the east. God would return following the same route as David. The prophet Zechariah picked up on this theme of the king's return. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Return to your fortress, you prisoners of hope. Even now I announce that I will restore twice as much to you. A few verses later, he said, the Lord their God will save his people on that day as a shepherd saves his flock. Later in his book, Zechariah offered what should by now be a familiar refrain. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem. God would return, and the king would return, following the pattern established by David centuries before. The kingdom of God would finally be reborn. And so the stage was set, and messianic expectations had never run so high. The people longed to be delivered from their Roman oppressors. The pilgrims were gathering in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, the anniversary of when God defeated Egypt and the nation was born. The talk of revolution was reaching a fever pitch. And it was in these moments that there appeared Jesus on the Mount of Olives. The King has returned and God has returned. The Jews didn't ride into Jerusalem, especially at Passover. They walked. Only someone really important would ride an animal into Jerusalem. Only someone like a king. According to Matthew, there were two animals actually involved, both the foal and the foal's mother. According to Mark and Luke, Jesus rode on the foal and it had never been ridden before. Perhaps the mother was brought along to prevent the foal from being frightened by this new experience. Matthew sees all of this as the fulfillment of the hope presented in Zechariah. The new king was riding into town. The crowds definitely did not miss the symbolism. They knew exactly what it meant for Jesus to ride the foal. They took off their cloaks, their outer garments, and laid them on the road that ran from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. And at this time, most people only even had one set of clothes. It was incredible that they laid them on the road to be stepped on by donkeys as well as other travelers. What an incredible expression of their enthusiasm and their devotion to Jesus riding into Jerusalem that day. They also cut branches and spread them on the road as well. Why would they use branches? Well, at Passover, part of the liturgy was Psalm 118. And this psalm is right at the heart of everything that happened this day. The psalm says, with boughs in hand, join in the festal procession up to the horns of the altar. The psalm celebrated the original Passover in Exodus. The crowds applied it to this moment when Jesus rode into town. The huge crowd shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David!" And "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord!" And "Hosanna in the highest heaven!" These are all quotes that also come straight out of Psalm 118. The people were celebrating the king had returned, and they cried, "Hosanna," which means save. The people believed Jesus was going to fight a battle against Rome. Jesus had a different plan. After all, he rode into town on a peaceful donkey, not a battle-ready horse. He would save his people, but on a deeper level than they could possibly have imagined. It is like my favorite Palm Sunday hymn, ride on in majesty, in lowly pomp, ride on to die. Bow your meek head to mortal pain, then take, O Christ, your power and reign. But Jesus wasn't done that day. You see, not only did the king need to return to Jerusalem to reign, but God needed to return to the temple. And God did precisely that, but with an unexpected result. Jesus rode through the city straight into the temple courts. But what he found was profoundly disappointing. The king had the responsibility to maintain the temple, not just the physical structure of the temple, but also its theological integrity. The responsibility of Israel was to be a light to the nations, but they had failed to fulfill that goal. It was Jesus' prerogative to behave this way in the temple as both the king and God, but his meaning is sometimes missed. Jesus' issue isn't primarily with the money changers. They were only the small fry. Jesus took issue with the entire establishment. It was a complete failure. And Jesus' actions symbolize its impending doom. As he would preach within a few days, Rome was going to come and the temple would be completely destroyed. Remember the saying that the blind and lame would never enter the palace? Well, here are the blind and lame again. And now they were coming to Jesus in the temple courts, and Jesus was healing them. A new David had come to reign, superior to the original David in every way. The temple leadership was indignant when they heard how the children were praising Jesus and declaring him the Son of David. Jesus responded by quoting Psalm 8, a psalm that is about praising God, not the king. And yet Jesus understood this verse was relevant to himself. The longer context of the verse says, through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger. Tragically, the temple leadership had declared itself among Jesus' enemies. Jesus was soon to defeat his enemies by the cross.